Welcome to today's deep dive. You and I are going to explore a true, just a massive paradigm-shifting revelation in the world of stroke rehabilitation.
Yeah, it really is one of those topics that just completely turns everything you thought you knew upside down.
Exactly. And we are pulling our insights from a few really fantastic sources today. The primary one is a landmark 2006 systematic review. This was conducted by researchers Louise Ada, Simone Dorsch, and Colleen G. Canning from the University of Sydney.
Right, and that was published in the Australian Journal of Physiotherapy, which is a major publication in the field.
It is, and we're combining that foundational research with some modern, highly practical insights on alternative interventions. Specifically, we're looking at some great breakdowns available over at aureums.fit just to see how modern electrical muscle stimulation fits into these recovery programs today.
Which is such an important piece of the puzzle now.
Yeah, totally. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore how a deeply entrenched medical fear, one that, held back patient recovery for literally decades, was finally debunked by rigorous data, proving that strength training is actually a critical key to stroke recovery.
And it's wild how long that fear persisted without being properly challenged.
It really is. Now, to set the stage for you, the listener, as to why this is so important, did you know that stroke is the third most common cause of death in the Western world?
Yeah, the numbers are just staggering.
And beyond that, it is the absolute leading cause of long-term adult disability. It is a harsh reality. But here is the historical plot twist that really, it just blew my mind. For decades, doctors, physiotherapists, and the broader medical community actively avoided the exact physical treatment that these patients needed most.
They did. They practically banned it from the clinic.
Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine waking up in a hospital bed.
Yeah.
You look down at your own hand. You send the conscious signal from your brain to simply lift your fingers, and absolutely nothing happens.
Which has to be terrifying.
Completely. You were just completely disconnected from your own physical form, losing agency over your own body like that. And yet, when patients were facing this exact terror, the medical community essentially told them, not to try too hard to fight it.
It's an incredibly devastating reality for patients to face, and you are entirely right about that historical context. To really understand the magnitude of the solution these researchers from Sydney provided, we first have to look very closely at the mechanics of the problem itself. Like, what exactly is driving that post-stroke disability?
Yeah, what's actually happening in the body?
Well, the primary contributor to a patient's loss of daily function is weakness. And in this specific clinical context, weakness isn't just feeling tired. It's defined very precisely as the loss of the ability to generate normal amounts of force.
Oh, interesting. So it's about force generation specifically.
Exactly. When researchers looked at the vast array of impairments that can happen after a stroke, things like a loss of manual dexterity or severe balance issues, it was this specific lack of force generation that correlated more highly with limited physical activity than any other factor.
Right, which makes absolute logical sense when you think about daily life. If you lack the force to push yourself up from a chair, you cannot stand. If you lack the force in your legs, you can't walk.
Exactly. It all cascades from there.
But historically, and looking at the notes, we're talking about standard practices, heavily influenced by things like the Bobath concept from around 1990 strength training was strictly taboo. It was just actively avoided.
It was completely off the table.
I was trying to think of an analogy for this, and it's basically like being told not to lift any weights or do any resistance training after a major knee surgery because your knee might get too stiff.
Right, yes.
So instead, by resting completely, your muscles just waste away to nothing. I just have to ask, why on earth was the medical community so terrified of having these patients put in real physical effort?
Well, what's fascinating here is how a perfectly logical assumption, when left entirely untested by clinical trials, can morph into an unbreakable rule.
A rule that nobody questions.
Exactly. The fear you are referring to centered around a neurological condition called spasticity. Spasticity is an abnormal muscle stiffness or tightness or almost a rigid spasming, and it very often follows a major neurological event like a stroke or a spinal cord injury.
Okay, so a stiffening of the muscles.
Right. And to understand the fear, you have to look at how the body normally operates. Usually your brain is constantly sending inhibitory signals down your spinal cord. Think of these signals as the brakes on your nervous system.
Brakes. Okay, I like that.
They keep your natural localized reflexes smooth and under control. But when a stroke damages the brain, those inhibitory pathways, those brakes, are often cut. As a result, the reflexes in the muscles go completely haywire, resulting in that rigid stiffness.
So the body's natural shock absorbers are just gone, and the muscle is constantly misfiring or tensing up on its own.
Exactly.
Mm.
And the prevailing medical theory at the time was that if a patient engaged in effortful, repetitive exercise like trying with all their might to lift a dumbbell, it would essentially rev the engine of a nervous system that had no brakes.
Oh, oh yeah.
Yeah, they believed that this intense physical effort would trigger an unchecked reflex loop, overload the damaged nervous system, and actively worsen the spasticity. They thought strength training would literally cause the patient's limbs to lock up further and become even more useless.
Wow. So they thought trying hard would actually backfire on them.
Mm.
We literally paralyzed our progress in physical therapy because we were like too afraid of further paralyzing our patients.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. The logic was neurologically sound on a theoretical level. It made sense on a whiteboard, which is exactly why it persisted for decades.
It was just a theory.
Right. The critical flaw was that nobody had comprehensively tested that assumption against rigorous, large-scale data to see if that unchecked reflex loop actually happened when a patient tried to lift a weight in practice.
Which brings us beautifully to the 2006 Sydney study. Because to challenge an established, deeply entrenched medical fear like that, you can't just run one small experiment with 10 people and expect doctors to change their minds.
No, absolutely not. You need overwhelming proof.
Right, you need an ironclad mountain of data, and that is exactly what the systematic review by Ada, Dorsch, and Canning provided. They didn't just conduct a single trial, they gathered the scattered, disjointed pieces of stroke research from all around the world and assembled them into one undeniable picture.
And a systematic review is considered the absolute gold standard of medical evidence for that precise reason. They screened hundreds of research papers and meticulously narrowed them down to 21 randomized controlled trials that met their incredibly strict inclusion criteria.
So this is a massive pool of data.
Huge. We are talking about synthesizing data from hundreds of real stroke survivors. In fact, 476 participants were analyzed for strength outcomes alone.
And the quality of these trials was solid, which is important to highlight here. The mean Pedro score across these trials was 4.7. Now, for you listening, the Pedro scale is a specialized metric used to measure the methodological quality of physical therapy trials. It goes up to 10.
Right, which sounds a bit low at first glance.
Yeah, I know 4.7 might sound like a failing grade in high school math, but in this field, it's actually moderately high because a massive part of a perfect clinical trial is blinding, meaning the patient and the doctor don't know if they're getting the real drug or a sugar pill.
Exactly.
But in physical therapy, it is literally impossible to blind a therapist to the fact that they're administering exercise, or to blind a patient to the fact that they're doing a push-up. I mean, you can't give someone a placebo workout.
You really can't. The inherent nature of an effortful physical intervention caps the maximum possible score on the Pedro scale to around an 8 anyway, simply because blinding the participants and the therapists is impossible.
Okay, that makes total sense.
So an average of 4.7, drawing from trials across the globe, is highly respectable and indicates really robust data. But what made this specific review so powerful wasn't just the sheer volume of data, it was their meticulous categorization of the patients.
Oh, right, they broke them down into very specific groups.
They did. They didn't just lump every stroke survivor into one giant bucket. They split the patients by time, and they split them by ability. On the time front, they categorized patients as acute, meaning they were within the first 6 months post-stroke, and chronic, meaning they were beyond that 6-month mark.
And what about ability?
For ability, they categorized them as weak, meaning the patient could still move a limb against gravity, and very weak, meaning they could not overcome gravity at all.
Let's pause on that timeline categorization for a second, because that feels crucial to the whole puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
We all know the dictionary definitions of acute and chronic, but what is the actual structural difference in the body? What is happening to the muscle tissues and the nerves at day 5 versus, day 205?
This raises an important question about how the human body dynamically adapts or maladapts to trauma over time. Immediately following a stroke, in that acute phase, the reduced force production is primarily due to a loss of descending input to the spinal motor neuron pool.
Okay, you're going to have to translate that one for me.
Fair enough. Basically, it means the physical muscle tissue in the arm or leg is perfectly healthy. The muscle fibers are robust. The problem is strictly electrical.
Okay, so the muscle itself is fine.
Right. The neurological signal from the brain is interrupted and just cannot reach the spinal cord to tell the muscle to fire. The activation switch is broken, but the engine is fine.
Ah, got it.
However, fast forward 6 months into the chronic phase, and the mechanism of weakness has severely compounded. Now, you still have that original electrical signal issue, but because the limb has sat completely motionless for half a year, you experience a physical decrease in the cross-sectional area of the muscle.
So it's shrinking.
Exactly. Secondary muscle wasting, or atrophy, has set in. Furthermore, the actual motor units, the nerve fibers that directly connect to the muscle fibers, they begin to die off from disuse. So now, you don't just have a broken switch, the engine itself is rusting away.
Wow. So time is absolutely of the essence. You are fighting a war on two fronts if you wait too long.
You really are.
But I have a major pushback here, specifically looking at that other categorization they used, the very weak patients. If someone is so neurologically compromised that they cannot even move their own arm against the pull of gravity,
Yeah.
how on earth do you strength train them?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. You can't just hand a dumbbell to a patient who can't lift their own wrist and say, all right, give me 3 sets of 10. How do these clinical trials actually accomplish this?
That was the brilliance of the interventions the researchers selected to review. They broadened the definition of what strength training means. They defined it not just as lifting progressive physical weights, but as any intervention involving attempted, repetitive, effortful muscle contractions.
Attempted being the key word there.
Exactly. For those very weak patients, physical resistance was impossible. So the trials relied heavily on alternative techniques and highly specialized technology to simulate that effort. They utilized biofeedback mechanisms, muscle re-education programs, which included robot-assisted movements to manually guide the limb, and, significantly, electrical muscle stimulation, or EMS.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I've been trying to conceptualize how EMS fits into this puzzle for a patient completely disconnected from their limb. It's essentially like hot wiring a car when the ignition switch is totally smashed, right?
That's a great way to picture it.
The normal way of starting the car, the brain sending a signal, is broken. But by applying electrical stimulation directly to the peripheral nerve, you bypass the broken ignition switch entirely and send a spark directly to the engine to get it running. You keep the machinery moving while you wait for the internal wiring to heal.
That is an incredibly accurate and mechanical way to look at it. You are entirely bypassing the upper motor neuron lesion, so the damage in the brain, and targeting the lower motor neuron directly.
Bypassing the roadblock completely.
Exactly. When the nervous system's internal communication lines are compromised, these external electrical impulses can safely and effectively trigger a deep, forceful muscle contraction. The resources we reviewed really highlight why this is such a game changer.
And it bridges that critical time gap we talked about, right?
Yes. EMS acts as a vital bridge. It allows patients in that acute phase to start actively building strength and, crucially, preventing that secondary muscle atrophy from day one, even if they have absolutely zero baseline mobility. They don't have to wait to heal before they start training. The training actually helps them heal.
That's huge.
And it is worth noting how much this specific intervention has evolved. Historically, applying electrical stimulation in a clinical setting meant wheeling in massive, bulky, highly intimidating pieces of machinery covered in tangled wires. Today, the landscape is entirely different.
Right, because nobody wants to feel like a science experiment when they're already feeling vulnerable in rehab.
Exactly. Modern EMS solutions, like the ones discussed on Orims.fit, rely on sleek, wireless, pad-based systems. They are intuitive, portable, and often controlled via a smartphone or a simple remote.
That makes it so much more accessible.
It really does. It has taken an intervention that used to require a dedicated hospital visit and transformed it into something a patient can safely manage in their own living room, allowing for the kind of daily, repetitive consistency that neurological recovery really demands.
All right, so they have the methodology, they have the advanced tech to bridge the gap for the weakest patients. But the biggest question hanging over all of this is the outcome. What did the data actually prove when all 21 trials are combined?
Let's look at the numbers.
Yeah, let's look at the 3 specific questions the Sydney researchers sought to answer. Was it effective? Was it harmful? And was it worthwhile? Let's start with effectiveness. Did strength training and things like EMS actually make the patient stronger?
Yes, undeniably. The pooled data showed an overall strength increase with a standardized mean difference, or SMD, of 0.33.
So what does this all mean? I need you to translate for the listener because on paper, a 0.33 increase sounds like a tiny insignificant fraction. If I am a patient on a recovery journey, or I'm helping a parent through rehab, am I actually noticing a 0.33 difference?
It is a great point, and it can sound misleading. An SMD of 0.33 is a statistical term. It doesn't mean they only got 1/3% stronger.
Okay, phew.
Yeah, it is a metric used by researchers to combine results from dozens of different trials that all use different ways of measuring strength. In the world of clinical statistics, 0.33 represents a moderate, highly significant positive effect size.
Gotcha. So it's a solid, noticeable improvement.
Very much so. To ground that in practical daily life, one of the specific trials included in the review, the Winstein trial, showed a massive 35% increase in wrist extension force for the patients doing the strength training compared to the control group.
35%. That is not a subtle statistical margin.
No, it's completely life-changing.
That is the literal difference between picking up a hot mug of coffee and dropping it on your lap. Okay, so we know it works, but now for the elephant in the room. The second question addresses the decades-old medical fear. Was it harmful? Did this effortful training trigger the unchecked reflex loop and worsen the spasticity?
The answer was a resounding, definitive no. Spasticity did not increase. In fact, the SMD for spasticity was negative 0.13.
Meaning it actually went down slightly or just stayed exactly the same?
Precisely. There was zero adverse effect on muscle stiffness. That deeply entrenched theoretical fear that forceful exercise would cause the muscles to lock up and worsen the patient's condition, the data proved it was completely unfounded. The treatment was unequivocally safe.
That is just incredible to me. Decades of patients were potentially held back by a ghost, a fear that made sense on a whiteboard but literally vanished the moment they actually tested it in the real world.
It is a sobering realization for the medical community.
It really is. Which brings us to the third and final question of the review. Is it worthwhile? Because getting a muscle to twitch harder in a clinical lab is one thing, but does that isolated strength translate to a patient actually reclaiming their independence and doing real-world tasks better?
Yes, it absolutely does. The researchers found that activity improved with an SMD of 0.32. And they didn't just measure this by looking at isolated muscle contractions on a monitor. They observed real-world, highly functional tasks.
Like what kind of tasks?
For instance, many trials use the 10-meter walk test. This measures gait speed, which is a critical marker for independence. If your gait speed is too slow, you literally cannot cross a city street before the light changes.
Wow, yeah, that is a very real-world application.
They also use the box and block test, where a patient has 1 minute to move as many wooden blocks as possible over a partition. It is a direct measure of manual dexterity, grasping, and releasing the exact mechanics you need to dress yourself or cook a meal.
So they saw tangible improvements in the exact skills that dictate a person's quality of life.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, in the context of severe neurological trauma, small, consistent improvements in these tests lead to exponentially greater independence. That moderate statistical improvement in activity is the difference between needing a full-time caretaker to help you out of bed and being able to take independent, confident steps to the bathroom.
It's everything. It is the transition from total dependence back to personal agency.
Exactly. Though I will add one important limitation that the authors themselves noted, which highlights where the field needs to go next. The carryover from strength to daily activity was positive, but it was somewhat small. And the researchers hypothesized this was likely because many of the trials they reviewed only trained 1 or 2 isolated muscles.
Right, that makes sense. If you spend 6 weeks only doing wrist extensions, it might not drastically change your overall ability to put on a jacket because, putting on a jacket requires your shoulder, your elbow, your core.
Exactly. The clear implication is that full body, comprehensive, and highly progressive strengthening programs would likely yield even higher real-world functional benefits than what was seen in these isolated trials. The challenge for the medical community now isn't debating if we should do strength training, but optimizing how we deliver it to ensure the biggest gains in daily life.
This entire journey really highlights the desperate need for a targeted, practical approach to rehab. You have this audience of acute patients who need to preserve muscle mass immediately before it wastes away, and you have chronic patients who are trying to rebuild from severe atrophy.
And for both groups, the tools are there now.
Exactly. The actionable takeaway for both scenarios is that consistency, progressive intensity, and leveraging the right tools are your best friends. We started this deep dive by asking a few massive questions. Why were doctors so afraid? Because of an untested theoretical fear of spasticity and unchecked reflexes. Could a simple, repetitive contraction be the secret to mobility? Yes, because a lack of force generation is the primary driver of disability. And how does technology bridge the gap? By hot wiring the nervous system, providing the external spark when the brain's ignition is temporarily offline.
A perfect summary. The 2006 Sydney study fundamentally shifted the paradigm. It proved to the world that progressive strength training is effective, it translates to real-world activity, and above all, it is incredibly safe.
It really is.
It serves as a powerful historical reminder that in medical science and in personal recovery, we must relentlessly follow the data and the evidence, not the unchecked assumptions of the past.
Absolutely. Whether you are on a recovery journey yourself, whether you are supporting a loved one through rehabilitation, or you are just deeply fascinated by the evolution of medical science, this proves the vital importance of tracking rigorous research. And by the way, if you want to explore the modern wireless EMS tools we discussed today and read more deeply into how they support these exact functional recovery programs, you can find some fantastic, simplified breakdowns of the science over at oriams.fit.
There's some really great information over there.
Definitely. But before we wrap up today, there is one final mind-bending detail from the Sydney study that I want to leave you with to ponder on your own. When the researchers were defining what qualified as a strengthening intervention for the very weakest patients, alongside robotics and EMS, they explicitly included mental practice.
Yeah, that part is just fascinating.
It means the intense cognitive rehearsal of a movement. Just think about that for a second. What does it say about the raw, untapped, incredible power of the human brain that simply imagining a physical workout with intense, unbroken focus, visualizing the attempt to move a paralyzed limb, can actually help preserve neural pathways and physical muscle function?
It really blurs the line between mind and body.
It does. It leaves you with such a profound sense of wonder about the depths of the mind-body connection and just how much human potential we have yet to unlock. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we will catch you next time.